On April 3, 2026, the gates of a federal detention center in Brooklyn slid open with a quiet mechanical finality. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic slow motion, just a man stepping back into the world as if he had merely finished running an errand. He wore a multimillion-dollar chain that caught the morning light like it was designed to blind anyone watching. In one hand, he carried a cartoon doll, oddly out of place, signed by a foreign leader, a surreal symbol of the strange intersections his life had traveled. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. People watched. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Hernandez. Calm. Unbothered. Untouched. As if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A lot had happened. And that's where the real question begins. How does someone the culture once declared would never make it out alive continue to walk free, again and again, without consequence? Is the so-called street code truly real, or is it a myth, something repeated so often that people stopped questioning it? To understand that moment outside the detention center, you have to go backward, far beyond the headlines, beyond the viral clips, beyond the controversies. You have to go back to a different Brooklyn, a different Daniel. Before the noise. Bushwick wasn't the version of New York City people see in postcards. It wasn't polished or romanticized. It was loud, crowded, unpredictable, a place where survival often mattered more than dreams. Daniel Hernandez grew up in that environment, surrounded by instability and struggle. There was no blueprint for success in his world. No safety net waiting to catch him if he failed. Life wasn't about long-term planning, it was about making it through the week. He wasn't a standout student. School didn't feel like a pathway, it felt like a delay. Eventually, he dropped out. Jobs came and went. Small hustles filled the gaps. Money was inconsistent, but the pressure was constant. So ask yourself, when someone grows up in a system that offers very few clear exits, how do they learn to see opportunity? Do they follow the rules? Or do they start rewriting them? The reinvention. By 2017, something shifted. Daniel didn't wait for permission to enter the music industry. He didn't network traditionally. He didn't polish his image to fit expectations. Instead, he did the opposite. He became impossible to ignore. Rainbow-colored hair. Face tattoos. Loud, aggressive energy that demanded attention whether you liked it or not. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't safe. But it worked. His breakout track, Gummo, didn't just perform well, it exploded. The internet amplified him at a speed that traditional artists could only dream about. Within months, he went from unknown to unavoidable. Streaming platforms pushed him higher. Social media turned every appearance into a viral moment. His debut project climbed the charts. Pause for a second and think about that trajectory. How often does someone go from obscurity to global recognition in less than a year? And more importantly, what kind of mindset does that create? When everything comes fast, does it change how you value risk? The alliance. Fame didn't arrive alone. Behind the visuals, the music, and the persona, there was another layer. One that wasn't as easy to market but played a critical role in his rise. His association with the 9 Trey gangster bloods. To outsiders, it looked like affiliation. To those closer to the situation, it looked more like an exchange. They gave him something he couldn't manufacture alone. Credibility in a culture that often demands authenticity, even if that authenticity is complicated. In return, he gave them visibility and money. It was a partnership built on mutual benefit. But every transaction carries a hidden question. What happens when one side decides the deal is no longer worth it? Or worse, what happens when survival becomes more valuable than loyalty? The collapse. November 2018 didn't come with a warning. Federal authorities moved in, arresting Hernandez alongside multiple associates in a sweeping case that dismantled the structure around him. Charges stacked quickly. The kind of charges that don't just threaten careers, they threaten entire lifetimes. Decades behind bars. Possibly life. For the first time, the noise stopped. The persona paused. The reality set in. At first, he pleaded not guilty. But something shifted behind closed doors. Maybe it was the weight of the evidence. Maybe it was the realization of what decades actually mean, not in theory, but in lived experience. 66 days later, the decision came. He pleaded guilty. And he cooperated. The turning point. Cooperation isn't a simple word in certain environments. It carries weight, judgment, consequences. At least, that's what people believe. Hernandez didn't offer vague statements or partial truths. He provided detailed testimony. He broke down structures, identified roles, explained operations. He told a story from the inside, one that prosecutors could use to build cases that stuck. Names were named, and those names led to convictions. So here's where the tension begins. Was this survival, or was it betrayal? And even deeper, if faced with the same circumstances, decades behind bars versus a chance at freedom, what would most people actually choose? Would they follow a code, or protect their future? The expectation. When he was released early in 2020, the narrative felt predictable. People spoke with certainty. He won't last. There's no way he survives outside. The streets don't forget. These weren't just opinions. They were presented as inevitabilities. But reality didn't follow the script. Instead of disappearing, Hernandez did something unexpected. He went live online, and more than 2 million people tuned in. Think about that number. 2 million people watching in real time, not to condemn, not to boycott, but to witness, to engage, to be part of the moment. He released new music, broke streaming records, stayed visible. He didn't move in silence. He leaned into the controversy, even mocked it. So ask yourself, what happens when someone refuses to carry the shame that society tries to place on them? Does the criticism lose its power? Or does it become fuel? The first return. Time passed. The headlines shifted. New stories replaced old ones. Then came 2024. A violation of supervised release. Another moment where predictions resurfaced. This is it. He's done this time. Again, certainty filled the air. And again, reality didn't follow. He served his time. He walked out, unharmed. No public retaliation. No visible consequences. Just silence where noise was expected. The second return. By 2026, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Another surrender. Another sentence. 90 days in custody. And then April 3rd. The walkout. The chain. The doll. The cameras. And the same unanswered question lingering in the background. If the rules are as strict as people claim, why does nothing seem to happen? The myth of inevitability. For years, the idea of a street code has been presented as absolute, unbreakable, universal. But Hernandez's story challenges that idea, not in theory, but in reality. Because reality is measurable. And what we've seen doesn't align with what we've been told to expect. So what explains the gap? Is it fear? Is it exaggeration? Or is it something more complex, something that people don't talk about openly? Maybe the code exists, but not in the way people imagine. Maybe it's not universal. Maybe it depends on circumstances, power dynamics, visibility, and timing. Or maybe it's been overstated all along. The power of attention. One thing Hernandez understood early, whether intentionally or instinctively, was attention. Attention isn't just visibility. It's influence. It shapes narratives, controls conversations, and sometimes it protects. Because when millions of people are watching, everything changes. Every move becomes public. Every reaction becomes amplified. And suddenly, actions that might have happened quietly become complicated. So consider this. Does fame create a different set of rules? Or does it expose the reality that rules were never as fixed as people believed? The psychology of survival. Strip away the headlines, the opinions, the narratives, and you're left with a human being making decisions under pressure. Extreme pressure. The kind that most people will never experience. Decades behind bars isn't just time, it's life. Missed moments. Lost opportunities. A future that disappears before it begins. So when people judge decisions made in that context, it raises another question. Can anyone truly understand a choice they've never had to face? It's easy to speak about loyalty in comfort. But what happens when comfort is removed? What happens when the cost becomes real? The audience factor. There's another layer to this story that often goes unnoticed. The audience. Because while critics speak loudly, support often speaks louder, just differently. Streams. Views. Engagement. These are modern forms of validation. And Hernandez has never lacked them. So what does that say? If someone is criticized publicly but supported privately, through numbers, through attention, through continued interest, what does that mean for their position? Is public opinion truly unified? Or is it divided in ways that aren't always visible? The silence after the noise. Each time Hernandez returns, there's a moment of anticipation. Predictions. Speculation. Warnings. And then, nothing. No follow-through. No visible confirmation of the threats people insist are real. Just silence. And silence, in this context, becomes its own kind of answer. The uncomfortable truth. Maybe the most difficult part of this story isn't what happened. It's what didn't happen. Because what didn't happen forces people to question assumptions. To reevaluate beliefs. To confront the possibility that reality is more nuanced than the narratives we repeat. So here's the final question. If someone can repeatedly defy expectations that were presented as inevitable, what does that say about the system those expectations came from? Was it misunderstood, exaggerated, or intentionally mythologized? Daniel Hernandez walked out of that detention center on April 3, 2026, the same way he had walked through every chapter of his story, with contradiction, fame and controversy, risk and survival, condemnation and support. And as the cameras followed him into the next phase of his life, one thing remained clear. The story isn't just about him. It's about the beliefs people hold, the rules they think exist, and what happens when reality refuses to follow them. Because for as long as people can remember, there's been this unspoken understanding, an invisible framework that supposedly governs how things play out. A code, a system, a cause and effect chain that feels almost mathematical in its certainty. You do this, and that will happen. You cross this line, and consequences will follow. Simple, predictable, almost comforting. But what happens when that predictability disappears? What happens when someone steps outside that framework, and nothing unfolds the way it's supposed to? That's where this story begins to shift. That's where it stops being about one individual, and starts becoming about something much bigger. So now the question shifts to you. After everything you've seen, do you still believe the code works the way people say it does? Or are we all watching something that was never as simple as we were told? So why didn't anything happen? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because it forces us to confront something most people would rather not question. The belief that the streets, the so-called system, operate on a strict, consistent code. A code that doesn't bend. A code that doesn't forget. A code that doesn't forgive. But reality suggests something very different. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore that difference. Let's consider another possibility. What if the rules were never as fixed as people believed? What if they were always flexible? Selective enforcement. Think about it. Across neighborhoods, cities, and generations, there have always been individuals who cooperated with authorities. And yet, many of them continued living their lives. Openly. Quietly. Without headlines. Without viral debates. Without consequences that matched the narrative people believed in. Why? Why didn't those situations spark outrage? Why didn't they become symbols? The answer might be simpler than people want to admit. Because they weren't visible. They weren't famous. They didn't capture attention. And in a world driven by attention, invisibility can sometimes be the greatest protection of all. But Hernandez, he wasn't invisible. He became something else entirely. A symbol. A headline. A global conversation. And that visibility changed everything. So ask yourself, is the reaction really about the action, or is it about who's watching? The power of visibility. When Hernandez testified, It didn't happen in the shadows. It wasn't whispered about in corners or buried in obscure reports. It was public, documented, amplified, impossible to ignore. Every detail was dissected. Every decision was analyzed. Every moment became part of a larger narrative. And that level of exposure does something unusual. It doesn't just create judgment, it creates value. Because attention, in today's world, is currency. The more people talk about something, the more powerful it becomes. And here's the paradox. The same visibility that made him a target also made him an asset. People watched him. Platforms promoted him. Artists collaborated with him. Even those who criticized him couldn't stop mentioning his name. So what does that mean? Can someone be condemned publicly while being protected privately? Can outrage and opportunity exist at the same time? And if they can, what does that say about the system people believe in? The bag factor. Let's not pretend money isn't part of this story. Because it is. And it always has been. Behind every public stance, every statement, every reaction, there's often another layer. A quieter one. A more calculated one. People who spoke out against him sometimes moved differently behind the scenes. Some avoided him, not necessarily out of principle, but out of fear of how it would look. Others leaned in, not because they agreed, but because they saw opportunity. Because controversy sells. It generates clicks, views, engagement. And in a world built on attention, engagement is everything. Hernandez understood that. He didn't try to escape the narrative. He stepped into it. He turned criticism into fuel, turned outrage into visibility, turned visibility into profit. So now you have to ask yourself, was he surviving the system or mastering it? A brutal truth. Here's the part many people struggle to accept. Street justice, this idea of immediate, inevitable consequences, isn't as predictable as it sounds. It never really was. It's influenced by factors people don't always talk about. Power, relationships, economics, risk versus reward. Every situation is a calculation. Every decision is weighed. And in Hernandez's case, the calculation may have looked very different from what people expected. Because acting against him wouldn't just be about principle. It would involve risk, exposure, attention, and possibly consequences that extend far beyond the original situation. So again, the question comes back. Was it ever about a rigid code? Or was it always about strategy? The psychology of it all. But the external world is only part of the equation. The internal world, the mindset, might matter even more. Because Hernandez made a decision early on. A decision that shaped everything that followed. He refused to apologize. He refused to carry visible shame. He refused to accept the narrative that others tried to impose on him. Instead, he reframed the entire situation. In his perspective, loyalty had already been broken long before he cooperated. He didn't see himself as the one who started the betrayal. He saw himself as someone responding to it. Now whether that perspective is right or wrong isn't the point. What matters is this. He believed it. And belief is powerful. Because when someone genuinely rejects guilt, it changes how the world reacts to them. It disrupts expectations. It creates confusion. It removes the emotional leverage people often rely on. So what happens when someone refuses to play the role others expect them to play? The myth versus reality. For years, people held onto a simple formula. Snitch equals consequence. Consequence equals closure. End of story. Clean. Direct. Predictable. But Hernandez didn't fit that formula. And because of that, the formula itself started to crack. Not because the rules suddenly disappeared, but because maybe they were never as absolute as people believed. Maybe they were always influenced by context, by visibility, by power, by timing. And if that's true, then what people thought was a system might actually be something far more complicated. Final question. So when he walked out on April 3, 2026, untouched once again, the real story wasn't about what happened. It was about what didn't. No retaliation. No clear enforcement. No definitive resolution. Just a man continuing his life, in full view of the world. And that image lingers, because it challenges something deep, something foundational. It forces people to confront a possibility they've avoided for a long time. That the system they believed in, the code they trusted, the rules they repeated, might not operate the way they thought. So now, we arrive at the final question. If the system people believe in doesn't consistently deliver the outcomes they expect, was it ever real to begin with? Or was it always a story people told themselves, because certainty feels safer than complexity? Because sometimes, the most revealing truth isn't found in what people promise will happen next. It's found in what never happens at all. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.